I made Milwaukee gloves. Former Chinese prisoners recount forced labor in Hunan. Chinese journalist Fang released after 3 years in jail for reporting on COVID. Japanese firms seeking U.S. investment deals face hurdles over China ties. Report: China is the world's largest jailer of reporters. Xinjiang might be notorious for its forced labor, but the Chinese Communist Party regime does not necessarily confine the contentious practices to there alone. Speaking with Wisconsin Watch, Taiwanese human rights activist Li Ming-che said he was also subjected to forced labor when the Chinese authorities imprisoned him for subverting state power in 2017. Li spent nearly 5 years at the Qishan prison in China's central Hunan province. He and hundreds of other inmates were forced to work about 13 hours daily, every day of the week, except for a few days around Chinese New Year. Under such a demanding schedule, they paid him only 48 cents daily. He said, "I was like a robot, doing work in the daytime and then returning to the cell at night." His job was to cut polyester fabric and sew them into work gloves, churning out at least 200 pairs daily. The product would then be labeled as professionally made in China. The working environment there was also harsh. Shu Lun, pseudonym, another former inmate at Qishan, said that it was too hot and humid and many prisoners got eczema. Li himself still suffers from allergies from the dust he inhaled while working. Prisoners can end up in solitary confinement for refusing to work, working insufficiently, or willingly damaging production tools. A more disturbing fact was that Li and Shu said they were making gloves for Milwaukee Tool, which means the products would head for the U.S. market. Li said he recognized 4 types of gloves: Free Flex, Demolition, Performance, and Winter Performance, sold in 2 Madison, Wisconsin Home Depot shops. Li said, "As long as I've made them before, I can recognize them." Their accounts suggest that simply targeting Xinjiang-oriented products won't guarantee that the U.S. can vastly clean its supply chains from forced labor traces. According to regulatory filings, Shanghai Select was hired to produce performance gloves for a subsidiary of the parent company of Milwaukee Tool. A Milwaukee Tool spokesperson also denied the allegations. According to the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Li Qiang, the founder of NGO China Labor Watch, said suppliers could mask their supply chain in various ways. Li said when a supplier is placed to produce 10,000 pairs of gloves but subcontracts half, it is too hidden for auditors to find it out during the on-site audits. Fang, the citizen journalist arrested by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, for reporting on COVID, has been released after 3 years in prison. Fang went missing shortly after sharing images showing how bad the pandemic was in Wuhan during the COVID outbreak's first days. Fang's videos on social media show that the Chinese people at the time had to endure the severity of the pandemic. Hospitals were overloaded with patients, and many corpses were lying around. His reports contrast with the pandemic report of the CCP's media system. CNN's source said that Fang's health had been affected during prison. He had difficulty eating, sleeping, and losing weight. Fang's relatives told CNN that he was accused of picking quarrels and provoking trouble by the CCP and sentenced to 3 years in prison. CCP forces often use such a crime to suppress dissidents. According to CNN, China's justice system is notoriously opaque, especially when adjudicating on activists. Human rights groups have repeatedly demanded that the CCP release Fang and provide transparent information about his case and those arrested for sharing information about the pandemic. Elaine Pearson, Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, told CNN instead of being celebrated for his courageous efforts to expose what happened in Wuhan hospitals in those early days of the pandemic, Chinese government, CCP, simply made him disappear in an effort to silence those trying to share critical information. Elaine Pearson added, "The opacity of his trial and secret detention are hallmarks of how the Chinese government regime deals with government regime critics with no due process." According to trade lawyers, Japanese companies that want to pursue more deals in the U.S. may encounter increased challenges due to their business activities in China. They said that some of Japan's largest companies were worried about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, which screens deals by foreign buyers and has intensified its reviews of their links with China. According to the Financial Times, the concerns come as Japanese companies seek more acquisitions in the U.S. after the easing of COVID restrictions that hampered overseas deals. With Chinese buyers facing even more significant obstacles to securing U.S. deals, lawyers said Chinese companies were especially vulnerable because of their long investment history, supply chains, joint ventures, and other Chinese business ties. Ahmed Mir, a former chair of the CFIUS Review Committee, said that as the geopolitical situation evolves, companies should be prepared for greater scrutiny. He noted that the CFIUS was not trying to discourage companies from doing business in China in general, but close connection of a group to China could complicate a review. He suggested that the CFIUS might ask a Japanese company how it would respond if it had to make a business choice over which Washington and Beijing were directly in conflict. Ahmed Mir also said companies need to consider future scenarios. U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order in September last year, stressing that SFIUS reviews must remain responsive to rising national security threats. Legal experts said the order signals that the CFIUS review process would become more invasive, although it may have yet to represent a significant change in fundamental viewpoint. One lawyer told the Financial Times that the CFIUS review for Japanese deals in the U.S. is not more likely to result in a block, but it will be more rigorous. The review will focus on China's potential leverage over the company, mainly if the company is heavily dependent on China as a customer. The CFIUS considers ties to China through subsidiaries, joint ventures, and cooperative arrangements, focusing on potential weakness in safeguarding technology. The measures could concern Japanese companies with joint ventures in China and share technology with local groups. Press group Reporters Without Borders has determined that China led the world in jailing journalists in 2022. In a May 3rd report, the group said the Asian superpower earned the title as it is currently keeping more than 100 reporters behind bars. The group put China second last on its annual index of press freedom, with only its neighboring state, North Korea, behind it. Reporters in China are often prosecuted under charges like espionage, subversion, picking quarrels, and provoking trouble. The authorities also use the three pocket crimes, a trio of offenses with vague definitions that almost any activity could fall under. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, tightly dictates domestic media to the extent that the group said that even state-backed news agencies, such as Xinhua News Agency, receive daily editorial guidelines and topics to avoid. The family of Dong Yuyu, liberal commentator and editor at state-owned Guangming Daily, said in April that he was charged with espionage. According to the Washington Post, he was detained last February. Even though journalists in China are not arrested, they are still subjected to surveillance, coercion, intimidation, and harassment. This January, CNN captured the moments government minders closely tailed its Beijing-based correspondent, Selena Wang, as she tried to probe the COVID situation in rural China. Besides giving journalists jail terms, the CCP would also confine them under residential surveillance at a designated location, black prisons, where the victims could face torture. The group also characterizes the CCP as the world's leading exporter of propaganda content. Wrongingly, a study by political scientists at Harvard, Yale, and the University of Groningen earlier this year showed that Chinese propaganda was surprisingly effective. The survey showed that the proportion of respondents who think China's authoritarian model is better than the American system goes up from 16% to 54% when exposed to its state-sponsored media. On the world's press freedom, Director of Operations and Campaigns as Reporters Without Borders, Rebecca Vincent said, "The unprecedented ability to tamper with content is blurring the lines between true and false, real and artificial, facts and artifices, jeopardizing the right to information and quality journalism."